Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful to be here to present to you my research concerning how courts in the United States are dealing with parental alienation. And this is all in the name of helping us answer one of the big questions we come across when we're doing evaluations, and of course, judges have to answer this question. When should a child's exposure to parental alienation require a child protective response? It's a really important question. And that's what my research over the past 18 months has looked into, doing a survey of all 50 states, including the District of Columbia. So today our learning objectives are to define and differentiate parental alienation and parental alienation syndrome, list the most commonly used parental alienation behaviors employed by alienating parents, explain why waiting for symptoms of parental alienation syndrome to appear before intervening is a form of child neglect, recognizing how type 2 errors occur when determining claims of parental alienation using models that focus on indicators of harm rather than acts of maltreatment. And lastly, integrating the peer-reviewed literature regarding child psychological abuse with the relevant research and case law on parental alienation and parental alienation syndrome. So what drives this research is my model, the parental alienation child abuse model. And basically it says that a child's exposure to parental alienation requires or should require a child protective response. It distinguishes parental alienation as a set of behaviors perpetrated by a parent that is likely to cause harm to the child's relationship with the other parent, and parental alienation syndrome as a symptomatic outcome observed in some children exposed to parental alienation. Unlike other models of parental alienation that conflate parental alienation with parental alienation syndrome, under the term parental alienation, the parental alienation child abuse model clarifies that exposure to parental alienation alone, parental alienation behaviors, regardless of whether symptoms show up in the child, constitutes a form of child psychological abuse that warrants a protective response. This distinction allows us to intervene early and aligns with maltreatment-focused logic of the child protection models we already have, and that is currently being used, as we will see, by trial courts, which was explored in my research. So under the parental alienation child abuse model, children exposed to any parental behaviors that are likely to cause harm to their relationship with the other parent should require a protective response. Now we know from previous research, this is a 2018 study by Edward Crook, and he says, parental alienation is a significant form of harm to children. As a form of individual child abuse, parental alienation calls for a child protective response. So we see he's sounding the alarm and directing courts and mental health professionals to respond appropriately when we see children exposed to behaviors likely to cause harm to the child's relationship with the other parent. So what is parental alienation? Well, we go back to Doug Darnell's research, which began in 1993. And back then, you can recall that parental alienation syndrome was not conflated with the term parental alienation. So parental alienation meant, at the time, and I argue that it still does, quote, any constellation of behaviors, whether conscious or unconscious, that could evoke a disturbance in the relationship between a child and the other parent, unquote. Now, what is parental alienation syndrome? Dr. Gardner said, quote, parental alienation syndrome is a disturbance in which children are obsessed with deprecation and criticism of a parent, denigration that's unjustified and or exaggerated, unquote. And he listed 8 symptoms: campaign of denigration, frivolous rationalizations, lack of ambivalence, which we recognize now as splitting, borrowed scenarios, reflex of support for the alienating parent, independent thinker phenomenon, absence of guilt, spread of animosity. Those are the 8 symptoms, the cluster of symptoms, which Dr. Gardner defined as parental alienation syndrome. Let's take a look at what is not a diagnostic criteria for parental alienation syndrome. Reject, resist, avoid, or refuse. It's not a criteria. Why do some PA scholars believe that reject, resist, avoid, or refuse are reliable diagnostic indicators of parental alienation syndrome? Well, they fail to understand the etiology of the resist, refuse, avoid, reject dynamic in PAS. Resist, refuse, avoid, reject, I argue, is a byproduct of splitting. It doesn't happen in all cases. Not all PAS-affected children engage in splitting, and not all PAS-affected children who do engage in splitting will exhibit resistance, refusal, avoidance, or rejection. And that's from clinical observations, forensic evaluation observations, the relevant scientific research, and of course, case law. Now, Dr. Dardanelle says in his book, Divorce Casualties, parental alienation syndrome symptoms describe the child's behaviors and attitudes towards the targeted parent after the child has been effectively programmed and severely alienated from the targeted parent. That means after they've been exposed to what? Parental alienation, as he defined it. So how are PA and PAS differentiated? Parental alienation and parental alienation syndrome are 2 different phenomena. PA refers to the specific acts of maltreatment that could cause harm to the child's relationship with the other parent, and as we learned from Dr. Harmon, not always. It doesn't always. And parental alienation syndrome refers simply to the cluster of 8 symptoms that may or may not appear in a child after the child has been exposed to parental alienation. Some contemporary PA scholars have conflated PA with PAS in their operational definitions of parental alienation. For example, Burnett in 2020, quote, parental alienation is a mental condition in which a child allies strongly with one parent and rejects a relationship with the other parent without legitimate justification. A similar definition appears in the Family Court Review in 2023. Sullivan et al., quote, parental alienation is a type of parent-child contact problem where a child, for no justifiable reason, expresses negative attitudes, beliefs, and behavior toward one of his or her parents, primarily due to the preferred parent's denigrating attitudes, beliefs, and sabotaging behaviors. So what are these definitions of parental alienation, these contemporary definitions, really describing? Well, they're describing symptoms of parental alienation syndrome, not parental alienation. They're describing the symptoms that appear in the child. And these symptoms refer to what? Indicators of harm, not acts of maltreatment. So PA equals acts of maltreatment, PAS equals indicators of harm. They're 2 phenomenologically different constructs. And conflating the 2 causes problems, as we will see. Are the contemporary conflated definitions of parental alienation capable of recognizing all cases of parental alienation? The answer is no, and why not? Because not all cases of parental alienation involve A, symptoms of parental alienation syndrome, we learned that from Dr. Harmon's research, and B, a child resisting, refusing, avoiding, or rejecting a relationship with the targeted parent. Those 2 factors are not in every case of parental alienation. So these are the false assumptions concerning PA when we conflate parental alienation with parental alienation syndrome under the term parental alienation. Conflating parental alienation with parental alienation syndrome creates 2 false assumptions. 1, symptoms of PAS must be present to diagnose PA. 2, the child must be resisting, refusing, avoiding, or rejecting a relationship with the targeted parent to recognize parental alienation, i.e. the 5-factor model, the resist, refuse dynamic model, and most recently, the parent-child contact problem model. Why is this important? Any model of parental alienation that requires the presence of symptoms of parental alienation syndrome or a resist, refuse, avoid, reject dynamic fails to recognize cases of parental alienation at the beginning stages of the abuse cycle. and my research that I'm sharing with you today shows that children are abused when they are exposed to parental alienation, regardless if they ever exhibit symptoms of the syndrome, or whether they ever display rejecting, resisting, avoiding, or refusing behaviors. In fact, the resist, refuse, avoid, reject dynamic is absent in many cases of parental alienation, and if we claim PA, parental alienation, does not exist until the child resists contact or exhibits symptoms of parental alienation syndrome, we commit type 2 error. So conflation in the relevant scientific research refers to the error of treating two distinct concepts as if they're one. So the parental alienation child abuse model, as I said before, posits that a child's exposure to parental alienation requires a child protective response. Now let's take a close look at the relevant scientific research which supports this model. In the recent Handbook of the Child Maltreatment, published by Springer, Hart et al. State one of the reasons why child psychological maltreatment is a challenge to assess cases of parental alienation that is often labeled as emotional harm or mental injury, which is inadequate because it focuses on indicators of harm in the child rather than acts of maltreatment committed by the parent. Now, looking at the annual child maltreatment reports published by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they are reporting that psychological maltreatment, which includes parental alienation, is only 6.4% of all cases of substantiated child abuse. Now, we know from the relevant research that that is inaccurate. A meta-analysis from Stoltenberg et al. Found an estimated prevalence rate when they studied 29 studies they looked at, over 7 million participants, found an estimated prevalence of emotional abuse, which includes parental alienation, 36%. So let's look at one of the good laws that helps us identify parental alienation when children are exposed to parental alienation behaviors, but before they develop the symptoms. So if you live in a state or a province that says the child has to show harm, demonstrable symptoms of significant harm before you can call it emotional abuse, it's a problem. But in Colorado and in my state of Michigan, we have similar statutes. And in this particular case, emotional abuse means either an identifiable substantial impairment to the child's intellectual or psychological functioning or development, or a substantial risk of impairment to the child's intellectual or psychological functioning or development. And this is mirrored in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, which came out, in 2013, and was recently updated in 2022. Child psychological abuse is any non-accidental verbal or symbolic acts by a child's parent or caregiver that results or has reasonable potential to result in significant psychological harm. So what does this mean in terms of identifying parental alienation as a form of child psychological abuse? Well, exposure. Evidence of a child's exposure to parental behaviors that are likely to cause symptoms of parental alienation syndrome, and we're talking about acts of maltreatment, is child psychological abuse. It's right there. You don't have to go any further. You can cite right to it. And then, of course, this is the either or. Impact, evidence of a child's exposure to parental behaviors that have already caused symptoms of parental alienation syndrome is child psychological abuse. So recognizing parental alienation child abuse happens in two ways. We have two types of measurement. One, the first thing I look for as an evaluator, has a child been exposed to parental alienation behaviors, any parental behaviors likely to cause harm to the child's relationship with the other parent? If the answer is yes, it's parental alienation, and it's psychological abuse. It's that simple. The second question then we look for when we're evaluating the family is, does the child exhibit symptoms of the syndrome? Has it progressed to the point where the child has internalized it? If the answer is yes, it's parental alienation syndrome. So we're going to go through quickly some of the most common recognized parental alienation behaviors in parental alienation: bad-mouthing, telling the targeted parent, telling the child the targeted parent doesn't really love them, communicating to the child the targeted parent is dangerous when they're not, limiting contact with the targeted parent for non-protective reasons, belittling the targeted parent in front of the child, inducing conflict between the child and the targeted parent, confiding in the child about the marital relationship, forcing the child to reject the targeted parent, forcing the child to choose between his or her parents, and withdrawing love and getting angry if the child shows positive feelings for the targeted parent. Now, the study you see on the slide, there's 56 of these behaviors that they recognized way back in 2006, and that was Doug Darnell and Amy Baker. But it's seminal research that helps us understand all of the ways that children are abused psychologically through parental alienation, which is any behaviors likely to cause harm, child's relationship with the other parent. Another good source for understanding these behaviors, this is Divorce Poison by Dr. Richard Warshak. He's got a section here on page 202 and 203 in the digital print. Exaggerating the target's negative behavior, telling lies about the targeted parent, revising the history to raise positive memories of the target, associating the label the truth with the programmer's implanted scenarios, instructing children to keep secrets from, spy on, and lie to the targeted parent, and programming the child to resist attempts to undo their indoctrination. I also included this study from 2020 because I thought it had something important to tell us. Saini et al. In the Family Court Review state that parental alienation behaviors include, quote, making repeated unfounded allegations of child abuse, unquote. That's a very common alienation tactic. And last but not least, this is not exhaustive, of course, but this is an important one. This comes from Wozencraft et al., and of course this is obliquely related to what we're talking about. Parental loyalty conflicts involve one parent interfering with the child's perception of relationship with and access to the other parent. So let's take it, I'm going to show you 3 quick synopses of 3 cases that highlight where the court found parental alienation without symptoms in the child. 2021 findings. Court ordered no contact between the father and the child due to his acts of parental alienation against the child. The mother was awarded custody, so there's a child protective response to stop the alienation. And that's Lalicker versus Harpkoff. And parental alienation, of course, this is what was found by the court. Father verbally abused the mother in front of the child, calling her psycho, crazy, Satan, and the evil one. I had one in Arizona where the mother actually would get with the kids at night, let's pray for daddy because he's possessed by Satan, because he cheated on her, so he's the evil one. Yeah. Father encouraged the the minor child to feel hatred toward and behave disrespectfully to his mother. Father shared court materials with the minor child. Wright versus Wright, this is a Nebraska case, 2021 findings. Court restricted father's parenting time due to his acts of parental alienation, and the mother was granted sole legal and physical custody. Now, these parental alienation findings, there's no symptoms in the children. They're not resisting contact, refusing contact. There's no lack of ambivalence, no campaign of denigration. It's just straight up parental alienation, or if you want to call it parental alienation behaviors. So, father made disparaging comments about the mother to manipulate the children. Father engaged in a pattern of discussing his criminal matters with the children and placing blame on the mother. And the judge did the right thing. Child protective response to parental alienation as child abuse. Bingo. It's right there in the case law. Last case I'm going to go over, because I got to fly out to New York next week. It's fresh on my mind. Mothers, this is a New York case. Mother's parental alienation failed to alienate the children. However, the court found that her behavior constituted a threat of harm, warranting a protective response through a change of custody to stop the PA. That's simple. False claims of abuse, bad-mouthing, telling the children the father was dangerous, and limiting contact. Now, lastly, I want to go over 2 forms of parental alienation behaviors that are from the Claywar and Rivlin brainwashing book, Programming and Brainwashing Children. First one is denial of existence. Alienating parent denies the social existence of the other parent. Of course, they simply never talk about the other parent, blatantly ignore the parent when they're at a basketball game or other important social event, or actually cut the image of the other parent out of all the family photos. I've been in home visits for custody evaluations, and they're cut out, like the head's cut off and all kinds of crazy stuff. And of course, the tertiary thing that happens here, this is a corrupting emotional abuse because it teaches and models for the children to engage in ignoring emotional abuse of another family member. So this is a learned behavior, and that's why it's so bad. And so when you're explaining this to courts, you can say that. Rewriting reality technique. And I want to highlight this because we're going to look at 2 cases that show the result if we don't stop it before the kids develop symptoms. Now, the brainwashing process doesn't happen overnight, but the rewriting reality is a drip, 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 and over time, eventually, some children give in, and long enough, and a lot of them give in. The parent attempts to convince the child to doubt his or her ability to perceive reality, mostly through confusion. The child observes the scenario from beginning to end, but as the brainwashing parent repetitively goes over the scenario and resists the child's interpretation, the original and true reality is ultimately filtered out. The rewritten script is eventually adopted. So let's look at the case out of Texas. The reason why I'm including these is these next 2 cases highlight the reason why we don't want to wait till children are brainwashed and exhibiting PAS before we intervene. This is a Texas case where a 10-year-old boy shot and killed his father at the direction of the mother. So here's an excerpt from a program on MSNBC.
He used the kids to hurt him.
Called them up, put the phone down, and then told the children, Dad never loved you. Dad didn't ever want you.
She's telling the children this.
While he's on the phone
and he can't do anything
and he can't do anything about it.
And they say Deborah was violent too.
She threatened to inject him with insulin while he was sleeping.
Deborah was arrested and jailed for that threat, but always maintained it was a joke and was never convicted of anything. As for Deborah's most serious allegation that Rick sexually abused his older son, his friends and his divorce attorney, Kathleen Collins, say it's outrageous.
It is the most ridiculous, baseless, groundless accusation that I have ever heard. And the only person that believes it is Deborah Geisler.
Rick always denied the allegations of sexual abuse, and no charges were ever filed. Rick even passed 2 polygraph tests. Rick's friends say Deborah concocted the story, convinced her son to believe it, and then shopped the allegations to 4 different law enforcement agencies. And they say even when the charges were not substantiated, Deborah threatened to pursue them anyway.
I wouldn't speak to my son unless you want me to call the police or child abuse.
Call the police.
Okay.
It worked the last time when you lied, Deb. Why not lie again?
Oh, no, I didn't lie.
You lied.
No, I didn't.
2 detectives said you were not credible.
Oh, wait till you get the next round.
What's the next round, Deb?
Oh, take care.
She is a sadistic, mean, vindictive woman.
Very vindictive. She was relentless in her pursuit to try to destroy Rick.
Rick's friends.
This went on for several years before it got to this point. In the next clip, we're going to see how the 10-year-old boy, Eric, heard his mother tell his, or the younger brother, 8-year-old, heard his mother tell his brother, Eric, to shoot his dad.
And there was something else. A school paper the younger child later wrote about the day his dad died.
The assignment was to write about a day you were afraid, and he wrote about the day that his father died. He wrote that he heard his mother tell his brother to shoot his dad.
And the prosecutors, when they're talking about how they charged him, the interviewer asks why they didn't charge the mother. And let's hear this clip.
Why did this boy kill his dad?
The short answer is because he was angry. The simple answer is that he had become so alienated from his dad, and he, in his mind, Dad was really the source of all of his problems. And if you eliminated Dad, you eliminated the problem.
Do you think Deb Geisler played a role in this?
There's no question that she created the poisonous environment that led that boy to shoot his father.
And I always, felt like if she didn't put the gun in his hand, she at least put the thought in his head.
Yeah, so that's the end point of corrupting, rewriting realities. They used to call it syndrome technique. So rewriting reality, that's the brainwashing. And we don't want to wait till that happens. That's why we want to stop it before it gets there. Here's another one from the Goscinny, Rucky versus Rucky. This is Footprints in the Snow from an ABC. This is a clip. And this is a good clip to see because Nico, the oldest boy, talks about how his mom stood behind him writing how bad his dad was on Facebook and how he was sort of in this woo-woo land of half believing and believing it and signing on to it, and later woke up out of it after he was rescued. But his two of his younger siblings were brainwashed severely even after they were reunited.
Sandra's strongest proof was always the testimony of her children. But today, one of those children has recanted his story. Oldest son, Nico.
Get up there, Nico.
That little boy from the home videos. And the same son who later posted that damning Facebook message accusing his father of physical abuse. He now says all of that was a lie, and that it was his mother who pressed him into believing it was true.
She started to say, like, your dad's this bad guy. Your dad, like, hurt you when you were younger. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? I don't remember any of this. Well, it happened to you. It's like, and at the time I believed it because you listened to your mom.
He says he was 15 years old and he couldn't understand why she didn't want him to see his father.
I felt really close to my dad, and I was still confused on what was going on. Like, why wasn't I seeing my dad?
Nico now says he never saw his father physically abuse his mother or his brother and sisters. As for that Facebook post, Nico says Sandra stood over him while he typed, coaching him on exactly what to say.
When I look at my writing then and what I wrote then, that doesn't sound like me, and I feel really bad.
He continues to tell us that you brainwashed them into thinking they were abused.
And you don't find that questionable?
Well, what do you think? You're his mom.
I haven't seen Nico for a long time. It's sad that he's saying that.
And this points out why it's so hard when a case comes to us where these kids are so alienated, and we're trying to work our way back and saying, well, I had a case recently. Dad punched me in the arm. And I go make Dad take 3 polygraph tests. I'm a mandated reporter. Dad punched me. Well, how did he punch you? Show me on the pillow. So we're going through extraordinary lengths of time, and this is a cautionary tale why we want to catch it. Hopefully these cases come to us before this alienation becomes so severe. So let's take a look at the model classification of parental alienation with parental alienation syndrome. This is a pictorial overview of the correct classification of parental alienation and parental alienation syndrome and how they fit within the gambit of child psychological abuse. All cases of parental alienation are cases of psychological maltreatment, as we just discussed. And this means regardless any parental, when we're talking about parental alienation, we're talking any parental behaviors that are likely to cause harm to the child's relationship, regardless if harm results. This classification is found in the appellate court record in the relevant science and has been forensically and clinically observed that trying to harm a child's relationship with the other parent is a form of psychological maltreatment. All cases of parental alienation syndrome result from a child's exposure to parental alienation. Therefore, and not all children develop this syndrome, of course. Therefore, parental alienation syndrome is a subtype of parental alienation. Where did that come from? It came from Dr. Gardner, 2002. And any model, including the 5-factor model, used for assessing parental alienation that requires resist, refuse, avoid, reject factor is a subtype of parental alienation syndrome. And that why? Because, let's go back. Factor 1 is not exhibited by all children who suffer from symptoms of parental alienation syndrome. It's just a fact. Maybe 90% have a resist dynamic, but there's 10% that don't. So this is the correct classification, and so we can understand how this fits into how we're looking at the big picture. And the big picture, of course, is psychological maltreatment. Now, let's take a look at my research, which began 18 months ago. I wanted to find out how judges across all 50 states and the District of Columbia, one case, were dealing with parental alienation. So we wanted to find out how are trial court judges determining whether parental alienation was present? And did the trial court take a protective response after they found parental alienation? So we did a Westlaw query, simple, quote, parental alienation, unquote. 50 states, DC returned 1,452 appellate court cases that discussed parental alienation, but our inclusion criteria were cases where the trial court not just discussed it, but considered it as a factor and made a ruling on whether or not it was in the case and whether, considered it. So our exclusion criteria cases where the trial court did not consider it. And so we ended up with 1,259 cases that met our inclusion criteria. And our coding process was we were asking these questions. Was parental alienation found by the trial court? If PA was found, did the trial court find it by symptoms in the child or parental alienation child abuse, as we just discussed? That means exposure to parental alienation behaviors. Our initial coding was, this is what we really literally put in our hundreds and hundreds of pages of cheat sheets and coding between 3 coders, including myself. PA not found, the trial court ruled out PA. PA found, the trial court ruled in PA. And then under the found cases, either found by parental alienation syndrome, meaning there were symptoms in the child, or found by exposure to parental alienation behaviors. The court using the parental alienation child abuse model. And here's what we found. These are the results. So in 570 cases, PA was not found. And in 689 cases, PA was found. So that's 55% versus 45%. And of the PA found cases, roughly 72% of them, 495 cases, the trial courts found them by symptoms in the child. And the remaining 28%, this is the good news, the trial courts recognize that exposure to parental alienation behaviors or parental alienation required a child protective response. And the majority, 99% of these, they took protective action in the found cases, which is a good sign. So this is our key finding, one of them. Trial court judges are using the parental alienation child abuse model, viewing a child's exposure to acts of parental alienation as requiring a protective response, reversal of custody or changing custody, modifying in such a way as to protect the children from further abuse. So next, we turned our analysis to looking back at the cases where the trial court did not find parental alienation. We investigated whether the trial court committed a type 2 error, which means a false negative finding, saying parental alienation was not there when it really was. And good news is it was lower than what we thought. We thought that the error rate was higher, but it was still unacceptably high. And then we had to dig down and find out why. So 198 cases of the found cases, or not found, excuse me, parental alienation was properly ruled out, that's 72%, and the remaining 56 cases were type 2 errors. So the key finding here is that some trial courts misunderstood and or misapplied the relevant science. Oops, this did not show up. I was going to show you my cheat sheet. So we're up to 15 states out of the 50 states, so we're still in the process of coding. So those numbers may shift slightly. But I wanted to give you an indication that in some states you'll have 0 type 2 errors, and in some cases you'll have a lot of type 2 errors. And the biggest cases are the biggest number of cases we found was in California and New York. So in our type 2 analysis, we had to determine whether the court made a mistake by ruling out PAS when they should have ruled it in, or PAS. And what we used was there had to be clear and convincing evidence of parental alienation the trial court either ignored, did not understand, or misinterpreted. And then we determined whether the type 2 errors had common themes and organized them thematically. And the first set of cases we coded as false negatives, we labeled as, it must be parental alienation syndrome. In other words, the kid must be showing signs of the symptoms, and we're not going to do anything. These cases involve trial courts misunderstanding the science of parental alienation as an act of maltreatment. Specifically, courts required that the child exhibited symptoms of parental alienation syndrome. In these cases, the court's rationale was essentially, a child's exposure to parental alienation does not warrant a child protective response unless the children are showing symptoms of parental alienation syndrome. Now, what does this conflict with? We just saw the DSM-5. It conflicts with the DSM-5 says likely to cause harm to the child's psychological condition. So it's a recent case last year in the state of Michigan, McMurphy versus Paz. And in this case, we didn't do it all because it's too expensive. I paid a handsome sum to pull the trial transcripts for all 12 evidentiary hearings, and we read through them more than once. Father alleged parental alienation and motion for a change of custody, and the court held 12 evidentiary best interests of the child hearings. Mom's expert testified, quote, ABSEC has never recognized parental alienation by itself as constituting child abuse, unquote, and that there is no medically accepted definition and procedure for determining whether parental alienation is present. Although Mom's expert acknowledged concerns that the minor child had been coached to make the sexual assault allegation against the father, she opined that, quote, it's rare for a child to give a report that is coached, unquote. She literally said that. CPS investigated, she was the alienating parents expert. CPS investigated the allegations. Of course, they did not substantiate them. The forensic interviewer noted in her report concerns that the mom was coaching the children to report during the interview. So, father's expert testified, and this is kind of where the wheels fell off the bus a little bit, even though the referee kind of had an idea in her mind, that parental alienation occurs when a child rejects a parent without justification on account of the other parent's influence, unquote. The expert provided a 5-factor model to identify when parental alienation exists and testified that all 5 factors must be present for alienation to be occurring, unquote. Discounting what? The nuclear bomb I planted in the kid with the false allegation of sexual abuse. That's going to go off as soon as we get the kid away from the targeted parent. The trial court found that the father failed to meet his burden of proving parental alienation because he failed to connect the evidence pertaining to mother's horrible behaviors to a negative impact on their minor child. It must be what? PAS. That's why we coded it as that. So since the children still wanted contact with their father, did not display symptoms of parental alienation syndrome, the court did not take measures to stop the parental alienation child abuse. The case got worse, of course, i.e. telling the children their father sexually abused them, which is the ongoing script that didn't get washed out properly because they didn't protect the kids. Here's an older case, the trial court from the state of Michigan. The trial court found that the mother's alienating behaviors were harmful, but not harmful enough to warrant a change of custody from the alienating parent to the targeted parent. Court's rationale was based on the idea that the child must be showing symptoms of parental alienation syndrome before it warrants a change of custody. The custody evaluator admonished the court, and the court even had a great evaluator in this case, and he said, with the custody remaining with the mother, and the mother being informed of how inappropriate her behavior is, the mother will most certainly continue her alienation and further devaluation of the father. This continued alienation has the ability to cause the most psychological and maybe even pathological damage to the psyche of the child, unquote. So handing it to the judge on a silver platter and not having any of it. So they didn't change the custody because the judge didn't feel the children were alienated enough. So here's a Kansas case, a court of appeals. upheld a trial court decision granting primary residential custody to the mother, despite evidence in the trial court record of parental alienation behaviors that exposed the child to significant psychological risks. Trial court concluded that there was no clear evidence of psychological harm, emphasizing that the child appeared well-adjusted, performed well in school, and maintained a functional relationship with the father. The court expressly declined to consider the mother's parental alienation behaviors as relevant to custody, absent a showing of actual harm. The judge remarked that the mother had intentionally tried to harm the father's relationship with the child, and that in fact the child and the father had a healthy relationship. The judge remarked that the mother had not intentionally. So the alienating parent didn't mean to do it. So no harm, harmless error, just keep the kid with the alienator. And that's why we coded it as this. And we coded this as a failing by the court, so a type 2 error. Should have declared and should have taken a child protective response. Now, others might disagree with that, but it's helpful to us because it helps us sharpen our pencils when we're doing this kind of work. So analysis. In this particular set of cases, this is just 3 out of many. What went wrong? The courts failed to recognize parental alienation as abuse based on the mistaken belief that a child must be exhibiting symptoms of PAS or RRD. What can we do about it? We can teach courts that a child's exposure to parental behaviors likely to cause harm to the child's relationship with the other parent should require a protective response, even in the absence of symptoms of PAS or resist, refuse, avoid, reject. The next set of cases, the second, we coded as false negatives, involved trial courts concluding that even when children exhibited severe symptoms of parental alienation syndrome, it would be less harmful to place them in the custody of the alienating parent rather than the targeted parent. The most common rationale, often echoed by professionals and adopted by the court, was the belief that the child would suffer greater emotional harm from being separated from the alienating parent than from being reunited with the non-abusive targeted parent. And this is a failure on many levels, but let's look at one of the cases, Krieger versus Krieger. There was substantial evidence, this is a quote from the trial court in the appellate court record. There was a substantial evidence that the defendant over a period of several years alienated the children from the plaintiff father and plaintiff's family, spoke derisively of plaintiff father to the children, and condoned and encouraged the children to make plaintiff's visitation with them difficult and unpleasant, unquote. Quote, we affirm the trial court's custody award to the defendant mother because it's questionable whether an award to the plaintiff father would have any significant chance of succeeding. These are the people in the robes at the appellate court level. I don't think it's going to happen. Pull the plug. Flatline. DOA. So in this 2023 case, we have another example of this. In re MB, and this is California appellate court case. The trial court affirmed a juvenile court's decision to terminate the father's reunification services and maintain the child's in the mother's sole care, despite acknowledging that the child had become deeply alienated from the father due to the mother's conduct. This exemplifies the too alienated to protect fallacy, where the court recognized parental alienation, but declined to act protectively because they felt the child's hostility was too entrenched. I've had a few cases like this. And the judge actually says to the alienating parent, go bring her to court as a 15-year-old child, screaming and crying, comes into court, screaming and crying, no, I can't go with you, runs out, have to grab her, put her in the truck, she gets home, and then I get a text message. She jumped out of the window, said, call the police, help, would rather be in the hospital on a psychiatric hold than be with her targeted parent. So we do have those kinds of cases. So they're all individual, and I'm not, I don't have the trial court record, but this just typifies how important it is that we exhaust every effort to try and save kids who are being severely alienated. So the appellate court affirmed this decision, reasoning that the child's refusal to reunify rendered further service is futile, so they're giving up. Both the trial court and juvenile court concluded the reunification was no longer in the child's best interest, based solely on her unwarranted rejection of her father. This case epitomizes the failure to protect a child from parental alienation because the parental alienation had already worked. Court acknowledged the alienation, but instead of removing the child from the psychologically abusive environment, it left her there, effectively rewarding the alienating parent and punishing the targeted parent. The rationale that separation would cause more harm than the alienation itself. We're going to move on. Let's go to the third, our analysis here, and we kind of covered this. In these examples, the child's too alienated. Type 2 errors, the courts failed to act despite clear evidence of harm from the children's exposure to parental alienation, resulting in the children remaining with the abusive parent, while the non-abusive targeted parent was permanently erased from the children's lives. What can we do about it? Teach courts how to intervene and stop alienation as soon as there is evidence of the child's exposure to parental alienation. Because typically when you get this far, and maybe they are too far gone, there's some point in the past where somebody could have done something. If you look back and you've done autopsies on these cases like I have, you go, oops, 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 oops. So it's both parents' fault. This is just one case. This is another one we call, it's both parents' fault. The trial court failed to do a but-for causation analysis of the parental alienation evidence, resulting in its finding that both parents individually characteristically, both parties' individual characteristics resulted in a co-equal toxicity. It's both parents' fault. Now, but-for causation analysis simply means but for this child's exposure to parental alienation, they wouldn't be exhibiting the symptoms. So if you have a targeted parent who's goofy, quirky, and weird, and they do non-alienating behaviors, it's not the same as an alienating behaviors, and we don't measure them the same way. So mother's quirky behaviors, this case it was an alienated mother, we're not risking harm to the child's relationship with the father. This is not a hybrid case. Father's alienating behaviors were causing harm to the children's relationship with their mother. The Court of Appeals found that the great weight of the evidence supported a finding that the father had exposed the children to parental alienation that was causing harm to the children's relationship with their mother, warranting a reversal of the trial court's ruling that the father had primary physical custody. I believe this was, one of the cases was Stanley Claywar testified in, did a phenomenal job, and it was reversed. I don't know what happened at the trial court level after it went back, but it shows you that there was a type 2 error at the trial court level, and this is primarily where our research was looking at. So there was one other that we're working on, error on the side of caution. This is a common one, type 2 error, where they just yank the kids and they say, oh, well, there's just an allegation, and we just have to err on the side of caution. And then a few moments later, 10 months later, a year later, oh, we were wrong about that. Too late, 10 months of abuse, 10 months of alienation, and we may have started with one thing, and now we have something else that's 10 times worse. So to recap, so we can get to some questions and answers, our key finding is that judges are finding parental alienation 55% of the time it's alleged. In 72% of the cases where a judge found parental alienation, the court used the PAS model, and with the remaining 28%, the court used the PA child abuse model. Judges are ruling out parental alienation 45% of the time it is alleged, with an estimated error rate, type 2 error rate of 22%. Now, it could be lower, it could be higher. We've only gotten through 15 states. Another key finding is the use of the parental alienation child abuse model is predicted to reduce type 2 errors. In other words, recognizing that a parent's behaviors towards a child that are likely to cause harm to the child's relationship with the other parent, even if harm never results, requires a child protective response. It may lead to greater recognition of parental alienation as a form of child psychological maltreatment that requires a protective response, especially in cases where there's an absence of symptoms of PAS or the resist, refuse, avoid, reject dynamic. So some of the limitations, we did not analyze for type 1 errors where the trial courts might have found parental alienation that was not really present. The data we analyzed was limited to what was in the appellate court records, excepting a few cases where we had access to the trial court records. And the implications are, courts have been and continue to recognize the term parental alienation as a form of child psychological abuse. They're saying that term means a parent's abusing the child with alienating behaviors, and they call it parental alienation, and there's no symptoms of parental alienation syndrome. That's what that means. Using the parental alienation child abuse model approach should lead to earlier intervention before the children develop PAS, and it should help positively influence policy and guidelines on how Child Protective Services and courts should handle alienation cases as part of a comprehensive preventive strategy to help stop this kind of abuse.